Society! Welcome back to my channel, Made Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we're going to be doing my March wrap-up. Okay, March was at once the longest month and the shortest month. Like, I don't know what happened to time in March, but it felt like I was in some kind of time warp, because when I looked back on the books that I read in March, I didn't even remember that I had read those books at the beginning of this month. I was like, oh yeah. But at the same time, I feel like I blinked and it's like a new school year in Japan, and you know, the lockdown is over that we were in, and I don't know, it's confusing. But let's go ahead and talk about the books that I read in that time frame. Oh, but actually, before I get started, shout out to my parents. Let's see if I can get this on the camera, who sent me this wonderful t-shirt that says, I love my library. And it has like a emblem from the library from where I live as well, so I can like rep my hometown library. I love this. I'm gonna be living in this t-shirt. So shout out to my mom and dad for sending me the necessary things overseas. I love it so much. Now, this month was a pretty solid reading month. I had mostly 4 stars. I had 1 5-star, 1 3.5 star, but nothing dropped below a 3. So it was a pretty solid reading month and overall enjoyable. The first book that I read was 4 stars, and that was The Butterfly Garden. This was just a random thriller. Like I've said many times on my channel, I like to do thrillers via audiobook. So if I need a new audiobook for my bike ride to work or anything, I tend to pick up, you know, thrillers. So I read the blurb of this one and it seemed interesting. So it was about a guy who captures young girls, tattoos a butterfly on their back, and keeps them like as his private butterflies. And that sounded creepy and up my alley, so I picked it up. If you suspend disbelief as to this book probably couldn't happen in the real world, it's a really good book. There are plot holes galore in this book, where it's like, yeah, see, that wouldn't probably happen that way. But the story itself, like within the world that the author has created, is really well crafted. I loved the characters. The story of like female friendship and bonding in this book is beautiful. So I really liked those elements of it. And for me, I was able to kind of suspend my disbelief of how this would actually apply in the real world. But I do know, I did check out some reviews after, and some people just hated the book for that aspect. So if you're a really big stickler for that kind of, you know, real world application, this thriller might not be for you, but I really liked it. It was one of those like subtly creepy books. It didn't have, you know, overwhelming gore or, you know, shock value in that regard. It was very subtly, slowly creepy, and I liked that. There are other books in this series, but honestly, I'm not interested enough to continue on with that. I'll just leave it at enjoying the first book and kind of move on. The second book I read on my Kindle was Frostbite. This is the second book in the Vampire Academy series. If you've been around my channel for a while, you'll know that I do something called the Retro Reads BookTube Challenge, where I pick a book from a cup that was published over 5 years ago in order to give myself a chance to read more backlist books. And through that series, I discovered the Vampire Academy series. When I was younger, I just never picked it up. And I'm obsessed. I love it so much. I flew through Frostbite in maybe 1 or 2 days. When I read like physical books, whether they be hardback or softcover, that's who says hardback and then softcover? I need coffee. Whether they be hardback or paperback, I'm very protective of my books. I like them to look pristine and nice. So putting them in my bag makes me anxious. I constantly like imagine folded corners. So I did finally purchase myself a book sleeve. So when that arrives, I'll feel a lot better, I think, about bringing my physical copies with me to work or whatever. But the point of all of this is that when I'm reading something on my Kindle, I can read it more on the go than I can another physical book. So I was reading this, constantly. Anytime I had a break, anytime I was waiting in line for something, I was reading this book. So yeah, I blew through it. I loved it. I think that the character development in the second book is just chef's kiss. We still love our responsible, broody King Dimitri. Rose is a main character, does so much growth in this book. And I thought that it was really, really well done. I do have the third book on my TBR for this month, so I'm looking forward to enjoying that. I think I said in my TBR it's going to be like a filler between two kind of bigger, like chunkier reads. So yeah, I can't wait to get to the third one. I gave Frostbite 4 stars because while I really, really enjoyed it, I would have liked a little bit more world building, a little more progress in ability, not just internal progress. So that part of the book was missing a bit for me, but still wonderful. So 4 stars. Okay, this third book has been on my radar for a really long time, and people warned me that it was, difficult. But I was like, psh, I got this. I did not got this. I ended up DNFing this book, and that is The Troop by Nick Cutter. This was not the fault of the book. The book provided exactly what people told me and what the book told me it would provide, which was extremely gross body horror. Now, for me, in general, body horror or like gore doesn't usually affect me so much. I think I mentioned in the TBR video where I was going to read this book that like ghost horror or things like that really freak me out, and I cannot do that. And I know that about myself. But up until this point, I was like, psh, body horror, who is she? I got this, right? No, this was disgusting, as promised. But I did think that I could push through, actually. Even though it was gross and I couldn't eat directly an hour before or after listening to this book, I did think I could make it through because I wanted to know the end of this book. It was like a good torture, kind of, because I wanted to make it to the end. However, speaking of torture, a big trigger for me is animal abuse and animal torture. And I didn't look at trigger warnings for this book ahead of time, so that's my fault there. But there is quite extensive and very visual animal abuse and torture in this book. And when the first scene came up, it's not gratuitous in that it's not necessary. It does help establish one specific character. So I'm not saying that it wasn't necessary, but I wasn't prepared. And when the first scene came up, I made it through and I was like, okay, well, this first scene was establishing kind of a character trait, the history of a character, so maybe it won't come up again. And then it came up a second time, and I barely made it through that one. Like, I was riding my bike and I almost stopped and paused the book. But then a third scene started to ramp up. You knew it was coming, right? Because of the way these characters were interacting with this sea turtle in the book. And I just knew it was about to be another horrifically graphic scene. And I just stopped the book and I realized at this point it wasn't a good type of torture wanting to know the end. It was like, why am I reading this book? So, because clearly it's not working for me. So I went ahead and just DNF'd it and returned it. I still want to know what happens at the end, so I might just look up a spoiler just to figure out how the story ends. But if those two things, extreme body horror or animal abuse, isn't a huge trigger for you, you might really enjoy this book because this book does what it sets out to do really, really well. It's just that particular thing is like the one main trigger for me that I just can't push through. So I ended up putting this book down. But the writing was really good, and because, like I said, it was very visual, I could tell exactly what was happening in the book. I could visualize it. I do want to read some other stuff by Nick Cutter that maybe doesn't have this kind of Lord of the Flies kind of vibe to it. So he does have one about deep ocean. And you guys know on my channel, if you've watched some of my other videos, I'm terrified of the ocean. But for some reason, I love reading horror and thrillers about the deep ocean. Maybe because I'm never gonna go there, I don't know. But if you can see behind me, I have like Into the Drowning Deep here by Mira Grant. This is a deep sea horror book about killer mermaids, and I love it. It's one of my favorites. So I think I want to check that one out by Nick Cutter, because I do think his writing was really good, and I want to see how that applies to a kind of genre that I typically enjoy. The fourth book I read was Empire of Wild, and this was the pick for the Only Good Book Club that I'm part of with Deidre over in Shade She Reads. She started the book, and there's a couple of us that have a Discord, and this was our pick for this month. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. There were some aspects of this book I really enjoyed, and other ones that seemed kind of meh to me, and that's why it gets kind of this middle of the road rating. The author of this book is from the, I think it's Métis. If I'm saying that incorrectly, go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. But the Métis Nation in Canada. She's an Indigenous writer, and the book is based around that culture. The book begins where the main character's husband has been missing for a year. They have a fight, and he leaves the house, and then he never comes home. And they're trying to figure out, or she's trying to figure out, what happened to him. But it seems like everyone else in her life, including her family, has kind of moved on from this disappearance, and they just assume that he's dead or ran away, and no one's really looking for him except for her. Interwoven with the story is the lore of the Rougarou. I believe that's how you say it. It's been a while since I've listened to the audiobook, so again, let me know in the comments. But this lore is about kind of like a wolf man, a spirit that can personify a lot of bad things in this culture. So kind of like the Oni in Japanese, where I say it's a representation of bad or evil, and it can take many different forms. The Rougarou is a lot like that. And the idea is that this spirit can possess a person and take over, and the person will disappear over time, and the Rougarou will take over. So it's entwined with this lore, and one of the things I loved about this book was the exploration of that. I really like when, mythological stories, we know me, I got a whole series on my channel about them, so folklore, mythological stories, I love that shit. So having that mixed in with the real world, and kind of playing with that kind of connection between past and present, loved that. I also loved in this book how kind of old school, kind of traditional wives' tales medicine, such as, using salt for protection, or, using bone dust, things like that were given real center stage, and I love reading about that type of stuff as well. So, A+ for that. One of the other things I loved about this is from the main character's perspective, and since she's the only one who's really pursuing locating her husband, she deals with a lot of, am I crazy? The world is telling me I'm crazy. Am I in my right mind here? And I think the author did a really good job of making the reader doubt along with the main character. I also don't want to speak out of place here, but from what I've heard from other Indigenous people's conversations online is that the idea of Indigenous communities basically being gaslit, I know that word gets overused a lot, but in this case I think it's accurate, being gaslit into, not thinking that their issues are actually as bad as they are. People from Indigenous communities go missing often, frequently, and are not given credence, with the police or with the government. They just assume, oh, that shit happens, but Indigenous communities are being really hurt by this. So I don't know much about the Métis community specifically, but from what I've heard about conversations, at least in America and in Canada, this is a big issue. So I think I'd like to check out some Own Voices reviewers to see if I'm on the right path here, but for me, I made a connection between the author choosing to have the main character be gaslit by those around her, and kind of starting to question whether there was actually an issue going on with the real world issue that many Indigenous communities face. Overall, I really enjoyed the setting, the atmosphere, and the, kind of psychological aspect of this book. But where it fell flat for me was the villain, or villains, I guess you could say. There are multiple aspects of who is the villain in this book, but for me, they came off as really one-dimensional, like basically sitting in a corner petting a cat's head, and saying, $1,000, what's it called, Mr. Evil or whatever in Austin Powers. This was the image I had of the evil villain in this story. And I think that works in some stories where maybe it's supposed to be a little more black and white, or maybe in a middle grade story, or something where, I don't know, the setting lends itself to pure good and pure evil. But in this case, there was a lot of nuance with the main character and the setting, and that nuance just seemed to disappear when it came to the villain. And I like when a villain makes me think. I like when I'm almost on their side. That's just the type of dynamic that I like. So that was missing from this book, and that made the stakes not feel so high to me. So unfortunately, that made the ending of the book a little anticlimactic for me because I wasn't so invested in the stakes we were presented with. So I think that's where, it lost some of the stars. But overall, I do think this is a great book. I thought the audiobook was really well done as well. The narrator is fantastic. The accents of the characters are really transportive. So I really, really enjoyed that. The kind of atmospheric, creepy lore aspect is also really well translated to the audio version, so I would definitely highly recommend consuming it in that format if that works for you. The next book I read was Take a Hint, Dani Brown. Finally. I did get this from the library a couple weeks ago, but I was in the middle of a bunch of books and couldn't pick it up, so I had to push my hold back, and that ended up putting me back farther on the wait list. You all know how that goes with libraries, but I finally got it in at a time that I could read it. So I read this on my Kindle. Again, I flew through this. These books are easy to fly through, and I loved it. As we all know on this channel, I'm not a huge contemporary reader, especially contemporary romance isn't my thing, but something about this series is like an exception to me. I don't know, I eat this shit up and I love it. This is the second book in the Brown sister. I think it's going to be a trilogy. So the first one was Get a Life, Chloe Brown. This second one is Take a Hint, Dani Brown. And then the third one, I don't remember the name of that book, probably because I haven't read it yet. I'll pop it on the screen. But this one also recently came out and people are loving it. It's Eve Brown's book, right? So something about Eve Brown. Each of the Brown sisters has a really unique personality, so each book has a very different feel. I gave the first one, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, 5 stars. The second one, Take a Hint, Dani Brown, I gave 4 stars. One of the things for me is the kind of witty banter between Red and Chloe from the first book wasn't as present between the main characters in this book. Their chemistry was there and it was really good, but the banter just didn't hit right for me. So I think that was one of the main differences for me between the two books, but I really liked both of them. Also, just like the first book, the smut in this book is fantastic. Do not read this in public if you're not prepared, because when Talia Hibbert wants to get spicy, she gets spicy. She does not hold back in a good way. So just be aware of that when you're reading this book. But that part of this book was A+, as I'm sure we've all come to expect from her, after Chloe Brown. This was just a feel-good story of 2 people in love and figuring things out. And you know what? I loved it. The next one on this list is the best one of the month for me, and that is Raybearer by Jordan Ifueko. This book is 5 gajillion bajillion stars. I picked this up via audiobook. I don't usually read big fantasies via audiobook, so I was a little hesitant, but the audio narrator was fantastic for this book. I think actually the author reads it. Maybe that's why it was so good. But I ended up picking this book up from my library because my hold came in finally. Story of my life. I expected this book to be really good, and it was even better than my expectations. This book blew me away. The magic system is so unique. I've never seen anything like it. The world building, the setting is beautiful, lush. The descriptions are fantastic. The characters I love them so much. And their relationships with each other are also so well done, realistic. You can feel like they're real people and you can feel their connection. And it's just, oh my God, everything was so good. Let me tell you what this is about in case you don't know. So this is about the main character, Tarisai. We start out when she's a little girl, and she is kind of trapped in this beautiful prison. Her mother keeps her hidden from the world, and her mother is called the Lady. She's this very mysterious woman who gives kind of tough love to Tarisai, and she has her own plans for what Tarisai is going to be and what she needs to become. And she puts all of those expectations and demands on Tarisai. And she doesn't have much of a choice in her own life when we start this book. But through some circumstances, she ends up going to the palace and becoming involved with like royalty and the royal court and things like that. And you get to see kind of her coming into her power and her personal growth throughout the story. I love Tarisai so much. Like, I just want to hug her. She is a very unique female character, I think, in the current environment, where most main female characters are like kick-ass, they kill people, you know, they're kind of cold and harsh. And I love that as a female character. Don't get me wrong, some of my favorites are that archetype. But Tarisai has a different kind of strength. She's still badass and can do a lot of these physical things, but her strength comes from being empathetic, from, it sounds cheesy, but from love and from coming from a place of understanding to other people. And that makes her the powerful woman that she is, you know? And it's beautiful to see strength represented in another way, and to see her come into her own in that regard. And that, oh my God, I was almost in tears with how proud I was of her watching that growth. The magic system in this book is also so unique. I don't feel like I can talk about it too much without giving away certain aspects of the story, but people have unique abilities, I guess you can say, in many different types. So this isn't, you know, a spoiler at all, but Tarisai's power is that she can touch something or someone and know its recent or not just recent, but all of its memories. So she's kind of a keeper and a teller of stories. She can also project memories to other people. So in this world, different people have different abilities, and it kind of depends on your place in society, how they're used. But I think that the way that these are connected to the monarchy in this book, or the royalty in this book, is so unique. Never seen anything like it. I loved learning about it and finding out details with it. And I was completely enamored with that aspect of this book. With all of it, really. I could talk about this book for a really long time, but I think my camera's gonna die soon, so I'm gonna have to cut myself off. But if you haven't read this book, read it. I'm begging you. I was convinced single-handedly to read this book by Sophia over on Fantasy Book Addict. She was like, please get on this, pick this up, have this in your life. And I'm so glad that I followed her advice. And now I'm gonna pass that on. I know I'm late to the game, so maybe a lot of you have read it, but if you haven't, please, please, please do. It is fantastic. In the beginning of this month, I was waffling whether or not to buy the special edition from Fairy Loot. Done bought that like 20 minutes into this book. I have it in my collection now in the States, and I couldn't be happier. The last book on this list is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. I read it, guys. I did it. This was my priority this month, and I buddy read this with Yasmin from Yasmin Be Reading, and that was one of the best reading experiences I've ever had. Like, her and I are so into theories, and we were bouncing them off of each other. The reactions were wonderful. I just had a great time buddy reading with her. So if you don't follow her or, you know, subscribe to her, I will link her in the description down below. Please do. She's wonderful. If you don't know what this book is, you're either living under a rock or you're not part of Fantasy BookTube at all, but this is the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson, so I can't go too much into like details about the book in order to keep it spoiler free, as it's the 4th in a series, but this book was 5 stars. Pretty much all the Stormlight Archive books have been for me so far, and this book is like a love letter to world building, like, and magic systems. Basically, we spend a lot of this book with 2 scholars kind of having a battle of the wits, and through these two, the battle of these two, we get to find out so much more about the lore of Roshar, the magic system, how things work. It's amazing. So if you're someone who likes to delve into things like that, this book is gonna be amazing for you, as it was for me. I wrote a review for this book, and I also tweeted this out, but I feel like I have to put this in my review as well, because my entire experience reading this book was just this meme of Leonardo DiCaprio, because the connections, the Cosmere connections in this book, they're the ones we've all been waiting for. It's not just Easter eggs, it's a whole like fucking Easter basket, you know? And it's just such a joy to start making those connections. The mental health rep in this book is also just a world above. It's amazing. You know, Sanderson has had thousands and thousands of pages to get us, you know, in depth and into these characters, and that is really paying off with the intricacy with which he can show not just mental illness, but any kind of disability. And I just love how he treats those things with care, and that doesn't disqualify a character from being a main character or being important. Also, the characters aren't treated as solely a representation of whatever they may be dealing with. It's just an aspect of the character. And there's so much more to each one, not just their struggles. And that is just beautiful, and I think that's such a nuanced and wonderful thing to see in an epic fantasy series that we don't always get. I mean, if you can't tell if I liked it, I used 2 full things of tabs in this book. I mean, it's insane. But it's probably my most tabbed book to this point. But I just love looking at that. It's so satisfying. Wow, my camera's really about to die. Okay, 5 gajillion stars. Loved it. Not a surprise. I love Brandon Sanderson. If you haven't started the Stormlight Archive, I highly recommend you do. It's just top tier epic fantasy. That concludes my March wrap-up. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these books. As always, your thoughts on them. If you haven't read them but you're interested in reading them, any thoughts and comments, I'd love to chat in the comments down below. But for now, I'm gonna head out. Johnny!